A black woman, Inez Taver, was denied boarding for having too many bags. The truth behind them shocked the entire airline. At a busy airport where everyone was rushing to their destinations, one woman's trip took an unexpected turn. Her extra luggage wasn't just questioned, it was treated as suspicious. But what the airline didn't know was that those bags carried more than belongings. They carried a mission that would expose. What unfolded next wasn't just a confrontation. It became a story of courage, accountability, and a fight against systemic injustice. Curious? You won't want to miss what happens next. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now let's get into it. The airport was alive with a cacophony of movement, hurried footsteps, muffled announcements, and the rhythmic hum of rolling luggage. Among the sea of travelers, Inez Taver moved with quiet purpose. Dressed in a tailored gray blazer and slacks, she exuded a calm confidence that drew fleeting glances from passers-by. Her hands gripped the handles of two large suitcases, their weight a testament to their importance. She approached the check-in counter, her heart steady, but her mind focused. Inez wasn't just any traveler. She was carrying essentials for those who had lost everything: clothes, medical supplies, and blankets destined for a disaster-stricken region. But as she stood in line, her presence seemed to draw an unspoken tension, a sharp contrast to the casual indifference shown to the other passengers. When it was finally her turn, Inez stepped forward and offered a warm smile to the airline staff member behind the counter. His name tag read Kyle Mute. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "I'd like to check in for flight 3177 to Port Harbor." Kyle's eyes flicked from her face to her luggage, his expression shifting from professional disinterest to one of immediate scrutiny. "Ma'am, these bags exceed the allowed limit," he said, his tone clipped. Inez kept her composure. "I'm aware of the restrictions," she replied. "These contain humanitarian supplies for relief efforts. I've arranged pre-approval for additional baggage through the airline's corporate office." Kyle's lips curled into a smirk. "Pre-approval, huh? Do you have any paperwork to prove that?" Inez nodded, retrieving a neatly folded document from her bag. She placed it on the counter, her movements precise and deliberate. Kyle unfolded it, his eyes skimming over the text. A flicker of irritation crossed his face as he handed it back to her. "This doesn't look official to me," he said dismissively. "We can't just take every passenger's word for it. These bags will need to be reduced or left behind." A ripple of disbelief coursed through Inez. "Mr. Mute, the corporate office assured me that everything was arranged. These items are critical for—" Kyle cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't have time to argue, ma'am. Either pay the excess fees, or I'll have to move on to the next customer." Inez felt a sting of humiliation as Kyle's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Whispers began to circulate, and she could feel their curious eyes upon her. "This isn't about excess fees," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "This is about doing the right thing." Kyle leaned forward, his smirk deepening. "The right thing, lady? You're holding up the line. Maybe you should have thought about the rules before bringing all this junk." The word junk hit Inez like a slap. Her grip on the counter tightened, but she refused to let her emotions betray her. "This isn't junk," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "These are life-saving supplies." But Kyle wasn't listening. Instead, he turned to the passenger behind her, signaling for them to step forward. Next, Inez held her ground. "I'm not finished." Kyle's expression darkened. "Ma'am, if you don't step aside, I'll call security." The tension in the air thickened, the hum of the airport fading into the background. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Inez glanced around, catching the concerned eyes of a young boy watching from a nearby bench. His small face was pinched with unease as he whispered something to the woman beside him. Drawing a deep breath, Inez turned back to Kyle. "Call whoever you need to," she said evenly. "But I'm not leaving until this is resolved." The challenge hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Around them, the crowd began to gather, drawn by the unfolding drama. Inez stood tall, her resolve unwavering, even as the weight of judgment bore down on her. This was only the beginning. The murmurs around Inez grew louder, a low hum of tension and curiosity. Passengers shuffled awkwardly, craning their necks to see what was unfolding at the counter. Kyle, now visibly irritated, picked up his phone and pressed a button with exaggerated force. "Security to counter 5, he barked into the receiver, casting a pointed look at Inez. "We've got a passenger refusing to comply." The announcement seemed to cement her position as an outsider. Inez could feel the stares, some sympathetic, others judgmental. She focused on her breathing, steadying herself against the storm brewing around her. Nearby, a middle-aged woman in a floral scarf leaned toward her husband. "Why can't she just follow the rules like everyone else?" she whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. The man shrugged, glancing at Inez's bags. "People always think the rules don't apply to them," he muttered. Inez heard them, but refused to react. She'd faced prejudice before, its sting familiar, but no less sharp. It wasn't new, it wasn't surprising, but today it felt heavier, amplified by the weight of the supplies she carried and the urgency of her mission. As she stood there, her mind flickered back to the images that had driven her to action. Villages reduced to rubble, families huddling together under makeshift shelters, children crying for food and warmth. Those bags weren't just luggage. They were hope, and she wasn't about to leave them behind. A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" Inez turned to see two uniformed security officers approaching, their expressions guarded, but firm. One of them, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped closer to her. "Mr. Mute called us over," the officer said, gesturing to Kyle. "He says you're refusing to follow baggage protocols." "I'm not refusing," Inez replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "These bags are part of a humanitarian mission. I have pre-approval from your corporate office, but Mr. Mute refuses to honor it." The officer raised an eyebrow and glanced at Kyle, who scoffed. "She's claiming she has some kind of special permission," Kyle said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "But her documents don't check out. She's just holding everyone up." Inez felt a flicker of frustration but kept her focus. "If you'd actually verify with corporate instead of dismissing me, this would have been resolved by now." The officer hesitated, clearly caught between protocol and the mounting tension of the crowd. His partner, a shorter woman with sharp eyes, stepped in. "Let me see the document," she said, holding out her hand. Inez handed it over, watching as the officer studied the paper carefully. Her eyes darted between the lines, her lips moving silently as she read. After a moment, she looked up at Inez. "This looks legitimate," she said, her voice steady. "But I'll need to confirm with corporate." Kyle's face reddened. "Are you kidding me? We don't have time for this. She's just trying to game the system." The female officer shot him a pointed look. "And you're just trying to escalate a situation that doesn't need escalating," she said sharply. "I'll make the call." Kyle opened his mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. He turned away, muttering under his breath as the officer pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Inez stood silently, her heart pounding as she waited. The crowd around her had grown thicker, passengers shifting uneasily as they watched the scene unfold. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing at Inez. "Why is that lady in trouble?" he asked in a small voice. "She's not in trouble," the woman replied softly, her eyes meeting Inez's. "Sometimes people are just treated unfairly." Inez offered the woman a faint smile, gratitude flickering in her chest. It was a small moment, but it reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. The officer on the phone nodded as she spoke, her expression serious but neutral. Finally, she ended the call and turned back to the group. "Corporate confirms her story," she said firmly. "She's authorized to bring the bags. There's no issue here." Inez exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief washing over her. But before she could speak, Kyle erupted. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's clearly taking advantage, and now you're just letting her get away with it? Unbelievable." The officer fixed him with a steely glare. "Mr. Mute, I suggest you step back and let me handle this." Kyle glared at her, but didn't argue further. He turned away, his face twisted with anger, as he busied himself with the computer. The officer turned to Inez. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. You're clear to check in." "Thank you," Inez said, her voice steady despite the lingering tension. She glanced at Kyle, who was now furiously typing on his keyboard, his hostility palpable. As Inez prepared to move forward, she caught the eye of the young boy watching her. He smiled at her, a small gesture of encouragement that warmed her heart. But even as she moved toward resolution, she knew this wasn't the end. The battle had been momentarily won, but the war, the one waged daily against prejudice and ignorance, was far from over, and Inez was ready for it. As Inez approached the security checkpoint, the relief that had begun to settle in her chest was quickly overtaken by unease. The weight of Kyle's outburst still clung to her, and she could feel the eyes of passengers following her every move, their curiosity like a tide she couldn't escape. Whispers rippled through the crowd, fragments of conversation that seemed to cling to the air like smoke. She must have done something wrong, an older man muttered to his companion as Inez passed. Why else would there be so much commotion? Maybe, the woman replied, her tone softer, more uncertain, or maybe it's just easier to assume that. Inez kept her chin high and her steps measured, though each word felt like a stone in her shoe. She reminded herself of the purpose behind her journey, the faces of the families waiting for the supplies she carried. They matter more than these looks, she told herself, but the sting of judgment was hard to shake. The security line moved at a crawl, the monotony punctuated by the occasional buzz of a scanner or the hollow clatter of bins being shuffled on the conveyor belt. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward, placing her bags carefully on the belt. Her movements were deliberate, her demeanor composed, but inside, her nerves were taut as a bowstring. "Step through," the security officer instructed, motioning to the body scanner. Inez complied, stepping into the cylindrical machine and raising her arms as instructed. The scanner whirred to life, bathing her in a faint hum that seemed to amplify the tension she carried. She stepped out and waited, her eyes fixed on the officer monitoring the screen. The officer's face remained impassive, his eyes scanning the monitor before giving her a brief nod. "You're clear," he said, his voice flat. But just as Inez moved to collect her belongings, a second officer approached, a tall woman with a stern expression and an air of authority. She glanced at Inez, then at the bags on the conveyor belt. "Whose bags are these?" she asked, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "They're mine," Inez said, stepping forward. "Is there an issue?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured to another colleague, who began to unzip one of the larger bags. Inez's pulse quickened as the officer reached inside, pulling out a neatly folded bundle of blankets. "What are these for?" the officer asked, holding up the bundle as if it were evidence in a trial. "They're for disaster relief," Inez explained, her voice steady but strained. "I'm transporting supplies to a region that was hit by a hurricane." The officer raised an eyebrow, her skepticism palpable. "Do you have documentation to support that claim?" Inez felt a flicker of frustration. "I already provided documentation at the check-in counter. Your corporate office approved these bags." The officer exchanged a glance with her colleague, then turned back to Inez. "We need to verify that," she said. "For now, we'll conduct a thorough inspection of all your luggage." Inez opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. Getting defensive won't help, she thought. She nodded instead, stepping aside as the officers began unpacking her bags. The process was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. Each item was removed, inspected, and laid out on a nearby table. Clothes, canned goods, medical kits, and stacks of notebooks were scrutinized as if they held secrets. The officers worked in silence, their movements mechanical, but the spectacle they created was anything but quiet. A crowd had gathered, passengers craning their necks to get a better view. The whispers started again, louder this time, their tone shifting from curiosity to suspicion. "Why does she have so much stuff?" a man in a business suit murmured. "Looks sketchy to me. Maybe she's smuggling something," another voice suggested, the words dripping with insinuation. Inez's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to shout, to demand they stop, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Let them look," she thought. "They'll see there's nothing to hide." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back, her expression unreadable. "There's nothing here," she said to her colleague. "It's just what she said, humanitarian supplies." The words should have brought relief, but instead, they hung in the air like a bitter concession. The officer turned to Inez, her tone begrudging. "You're free to go." Inez nodded, gathering her belongings with deliberate care. She folded each item back into her bags, her movements precise but heavy with the weight of humiliation. Around her, the crowd began to disperse, their curiosity sated, but the echoes of their judgment lingered. As she zipped up the last bag, A small voice broke through the tension. Excuse me. Inez turned to see a young girl, no more than 8 or 9, standing a few feet away. Her wide eyes were filled with something Inez hadn't seen all day, kindness. Are you helping people? The girl asked, her voice tentative. Inez managed a small smile. Yes, I am. The girl nodded, her expression serious. That's good. My mom says we should always help people. Inez's smile grew, a warmth spreading through her chest. Your mom's right, she said gently. We should. The girl's mother appeared then, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. She met Inez's gaze and offered a small, apologetic nod. It was a quiet moment, but it carried a weight that words couldn't convey. As Inez finally made her way to the gate, her steps felt heavier than before. The injustice she had faced today was one of countless others, a reminder of the barriers that still existed. But as she thought of the girl's words, a spark of hope flickered within her. Even in the darkest moments, there were glimpses of light, and sometimes that was enough to keep going. The gate area was surprisingly quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. Inez took a seat near the window, placing her bags beside her with a care that mirrored her thoughts. She gazed out at the tarmac, where planes taxied gracefully against the backdrop of a setting sun. The warm hues painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, but for Inez, the beauty outside felt distant, disconnected from the turmoil within her. She leaned back, exhaling a long, slow breath, but the knot in her chest refused to loosen. The ordeal at security had left its mark, not just in the exhaustion she felt, but in the weight of the gazes she could still sense around her. Though no one at the gate was openly staring, she could feel the unspoken curiosity, the lingering judgment. It was as though the invisible residue of the earlier confrontation clung to her, refusing to let her move on. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. She fished it out of her pocket and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Daria, her assistant back at the foundation. Inez, everything's set for the drop-off tomorrow. The team is already on the ground. Safe travels. The words were meant to reassure, but they only deepened her frustration. The team was counting on her, and instead of focusing on the mission, she was battling indignities that had nothing to do with the work at hand. She typed a quick reply, short, polite, but devoid of the warmth she usually carried, and set the phone down on her lap. As she did, a shadow loomed over her. She looked up to see the officer from security, the shorter woman who had ultimately cleared her to pass. The officer's expression was neutral, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or a twinge of guilt. Miss Taver, the officer said quietly. Inez straightened. Yes. The officer hesitated, as though searching for the right words. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how things went back there. It wasn't personal. Inez studied her, taking in the stiffness of her posture, the way her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. The apology, though sincere, felt incomplete, like a patch over a deeper wound. Maybe it wasn't personal to you, Inez said, her voice measured, but it was very personal to me. The officer nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. I understand. We were just doing our job. Were you? Inez asked, her tone soft but pointed, because it felt like I was being singled out. The officer flinched slightly, her composure faltering. She glanced around, as though ensuring no one else was listening, before leaning in closer. Off the record, she said in a low voice, you're not wrong. He has a history of making assumptions about people, and he's been reported before. Inez's eyes narrowed. But he's still here? The officer sighed. He is. It's complicated. These things always are. Inez leaned back in her seat, her expression guarded. Complicated for who? Because it seems pretty simple to me. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at Inez's bags, neatly arranged beside her. Look, I know this doesn't fix anything, but what you're doing, it's important. More people should be like you. The words, though well-meaning, rang hollow. Inez offered a polite nod, but inside, her frustration simmered. She didn't want praise or platitudes. She wanted accountability, change, a world where people like Kyle didn't get to hide behind policies while perpetuating prejudice. The officer straightened, sensing the conversation had reached its end. Safe travels, Miss Taver, she said, her tone formal once more. Thank you, Inez replied, her voice cool. She watched as the officer walked away, her figure disappearing into the sea of passengers. The announcement for her flight crackled over the intercom, jolting her back to the present. She stood, gathering her bags and joining the line to board. The process was routine, yet every step felt laden with the weight of what had come before. As she approached the boarding agent, her heart quickened. Would there be another issue? Another excuse to single her out? She handed over her boarding pass, her expression neutral, but her pulse thrumming like a drumbeat. The agent scanned the pass and handed it back without a word. Inez exhaled quietly, stepping onto the jet bridge. The sterile tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before her, a corridor of both transition and anticipation. Each step felt heavier, her thoughts circling back to the faces she'd encountered. The judgmental passengers, the indifferent officers, the apologetic child. She reached the plane and found her seat, a window near the middle of the cabin. Settling in, she placed her bags beneath the seat in front of her, their weight both literal and symbolic. As the plane filled, she turned her gaze to the window, watching as the tarmac crew bustled below. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared beside her, a young man with a warm smile. He leaned down slightly. "Miss Taver?" he asked, his tone polite. "Yes," she replied, her guard instinctively rising. "We've received a note from corporate about your mission," he said. "They've asked us to extend any assistance you need during the flight. If there's anything at all, please don't hesitate to let me know." Inez blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice cautious. As the attendant moved away, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, yes, but also a lingering sense of unease. The gesture, while kind, didn't erase the earlier indignities. It felt like a band-aid on a fracture. The plane began to taxi, the engines roaring to life. As it lifted into the sky, Inez leaned her head against the window, her reflection staring back at her. This flight was just one leg of the journey, a small piece of the larger battle she fought every day. And though the sky seemed calm now, she knew storms always loomed on the horizon. For Inez, the mission wasn't just about the supplies in her bags. It was about proving that even in a world that often sought to diminish her, she could, and would, rise above. The morning arrived like a reluctant guest, gray clouds hanging low over the city. The damp chill of the air outside seeped into the edges of Inez's hotel room, but she was oblivious to the weather. Inside, she was seated at the small desk near the window, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the glow of her laptop screen. The room was silent, save for the soft clatter of her fingers against the keyboard. Each keystroke was deliberate, carrying the weight of the story she was crafting. Her story. She had spent hours the night before, drafting the letter, revising it with the precision of someone building an unassailable case. This wasn't just a recounting of her experience. It was a call to action, a demand for accountability, and a challenge to the systemic biases she had faced. The words on the screen were sharp, uncompromising, and filled with a quiet power. Inez leaned back, rereading the letter for the 10th time. Her chest tightened as she relived every detail of the previous day, the dismissive sneers, the invasive inspection, the humiliating stares of strangers. Her experiences were all too common, shared by countless others who lacked the voice or resources to push back. That thought stiffened her resolve. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for everyone who had ever been diminished, ignored, or dismissed. Her phone buzzed beside her, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Daria, her assistant at the foundation. "Hey Inez, just a reminder, we're all behind you. Whatever you need, just say the word." Inez stared at the message for a moment before typing a quick reply. "Thanks, Dar. I've got this." She set the phone down and returned to her work. The words on the screen were finished, but her fight was just beginning. By mid-morning, Inez stood in the gleaming lobby of the airline's regional headquarters. The building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass and steel, designed to project authority and efficiency. Yet, for Inez, it felt hollow, like a monument to a system that prioritized appearances over accountability. She approached the front desk, where a receptionist greeted her with a polite, but practiced, smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with someone in leadership," Inez said, her voice steady but firm. "It's about an incident involving one of your employees." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Inez replied, her gaze unyielding. But I believe they'll want to hear what I have to say. The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone. Something in Inez's tone, a quiet but undeniable authority, seemed to push her toward action. Finally, she nodded. Please have a seat. I'll see who's available. Inez sat in the waiting area, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The space around her was pristine and cold, designed to intimidate rather than invite. She glanced at the polished floors, the minimalist decor, the faint hum of ambient music. It all felt calculated, as if to convey that problems here were swiftly handled or hidden. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. Finally, a young assistant appeared, introducing herself as Sarah. "Miss Taver, please follow me," she said, motioning toward a long corridor. The conference room was as sterile as the lobby, its glass walls and metallic accents reflecting the fluorescent lights above. Inez took a seat at one end of the table, her movements deliberate. The assistant gestured for her to wait before leaving the room. Moments later, two figures entered. One was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a tailored navy suit that screamed corporate polish. He introduced himself as Jason Vang, the regional manager. The other was Sarah, who followed behind him with a notepad and pen, ready to document every word. "Miss Taver," Jason began, his voice smooth but rehearsed. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We're here to listen and understand your concerns." Inez met his gaze, her own unwavering. "Thank you for making the time," she said. "But I'm not here to air concerns. I'm here to address a systemic problem." She slid a printed copy of her letter across the table. "This outlines my experience, as well as the broader issues it represents. I'd like you to read it before we proceed." Jason hesitated, then picked up the letter. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and Inez watched as the faint smile on his lips faded. He glanced at Sarah, who began jotting notes furiously, her pen scratching against the paper like the sound of distant thunder. When Jason looked up, his expression was guarded. "Miss Taver, I want to assure you that we take allegations of discrimination very seriously. This is not the kind of behavior we condone. With respect, Mr. Vang," Inez said, leaning forward slightly. "Words are easy. Action is harder." Kyle Mute, the employee in question, has a documented history of complaints, yet he remains in his position. "What?" Jason cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "I'm unable to comment on personnel matters." "You don't need to comment," Inez interrupted, her voice calm but cutting. "The facts speak for themselves, and they paint a picture of a company more concerned with optics than accountability." The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah shifted in her seat, her pen hovering uncertainly over her notebook. Jason, for his part, seemed to falter, his polished demeanor cracking under Inez's steady gaze. "We're committed to conducting a thorough investigation," he said finally, "and we'll take appropriate action based on the findings." Inez raised an eyebrow, her expression unflinching. "And what happens in the meantime? How many more passengers will be subjected to this treatment? How many more complaints will be dismissed as unfounded?" Jason had no answer. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, he sighed. "You're right, Miss Taver. We need to do better. I'll personally oversee this matter and ensure it's addressed." "I'll hold you to that," Inez replied, her tone sharp but steady. She stood, gathering her belongings with deliberate care. As she moved toward the door, she paused and turned back. "Change doesn't come from words, Mr. Vang," she said. "It comes from actions. I'll be watching to see if you're willing to take them." With that, she left the room, her steps measured, her resolve unwavering. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in pale, hesitant rays. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. And for Inez, that was enough for now. The cold air outside the headquarters bit at Inez's cheeks as she stepped out onto the street. Her breath condensed into soft plumes, dissipating into the city's morning bustle. But the sting of the wind was nothing compared to the simmering ache in her chest. The meeting had been a small step forward, a chink in the armor of an unyielding system, but it was far from the resolution she craved. The battle for accountability, for justice, was only just beginning. As she walked toward a nearby cafe, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She retrieved it with one hand, the other gripping the strap of her bag as if steadying herself. The screen displayed a name she hadn't seen in months, Priya Zinta, a fellow advocate. Priya had been one of the most vocal voices in dismantling systemic racism in corporate spaces. Her call felt timely, almost uncanny. Priya? Inez said after answering, her voice carrying the faintest trace of exhaustion. I heard what happened, Priya said without preamble. Her tone was low, tinged with both concern and fire. It's already making waves. Inez's brow furrowed as she stepped inside the cafe, the warmth of the space enveloping her. Waves? She repeated, moving toward the counter. There's chatter on social media, Priya explained. People are talking about the systemic issues you're highlighting, and more importantly, some of those voices are from inside the airline. Inez felt her pulse quicken. She ordered a black coffee, barely processing the cashier's polite words, and found a seat near the window. Inside the airline? What are they saying? Priya hesitated. It's not all public yet, but a few employees are hinting at long-standing patterns that align with what you experienced. Discrimination, bias in hiring practices, retaliation against staff who speak up. It's bigger than just Kyle Mute. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Inez stared out at the street, where pedestrians hurried by, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind. Bigger than just Kyle, she murmured, her fingers tightening around the phone. She had suspected as much. Systems like this rarely hinged on a single individual, but hearing it confirmed added weight to her mission. Inez, Priya said gently, this could be an opportunity. You've got leverage now. If employees are willing to come forward, we can push for real change, not just a band-aid solution. Inez closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. The idea of leverage felt almost foreign to her. So often, she was the one fighting uphill, pushing against walls that refused to budge. But now, the tide was shifting, however slightly. What do you need from me? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Keep the pressure on, Priya replied. Document everything. Publicize it if you have to. And if anyone from the airline reaches out, lawyers, PR, and you needn't agree to anything without consulting first. They'll want to control the narrative. Inez nodded, even though Priya couldn't see her. Understood. And Inez, Priya's tone softened. Take care of yourself. This fight isn't going to be easy. A faint smile touched Inez's lips. When is it ever? They ended the call, and Inez set her phone on the table. Her coffee sat untouched, the steam curling upward in lazy tendrils. She stared at it, her mind turning over Priya's words. This wasn't just about her experience anymore. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed people like Kyle to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. That evening, Inez returned to her hotel room, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders. She set her bag on the bed and retrieved her laptop, opening it with a deliberate slowness. The glow of the screen lit up the dim room, and she began typing, first hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Her words weren't just a recounting of events, they were a rallying cry. She detailed her experience with the airline, highlighting the dismissive attitudes, the invasive inspections, and the systemic biases that had become glaringly apparent. She framed it not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed with urgency. By the time she finished, the clock read past midnight. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she reread the final paragraph aloud. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless individuals who have faced similar indignities and been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. It's about creating a world where accountability is more than a corporate buzzword, where policies aren't just words on paper, but actions that shape a better, fairer future. And I won't stop until that future becomes a reality. She saved the document and leaned back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at the edges of her mind. But even as fatigue set in, there was a flicker of something else, determination. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The next morning, Inez's email inbox was flooded with responses. Some were from supporters, friends, colleagues, and strangers who had read her story and offered words of encouragement. Others were more formal. Inquiries from journalists, outreach from advocacy groups, and a carefully worded email from the airline's legal department. She opened the latter with cautious curiosity. The message was polite, almost overly so, and requested a follow-up meeting to discuss her concerns further. Inez's eyes narrowed as she reread the words. This wasn't an admission of guilt, it was damage control. They were trying to contain the fallout. But what the airline didn't realize was that this fight had already outgrown their boardrooms and press statements. The voices gathering behind Inez were growing louder, stronger, and more unified, and she wasn't going to let them be silenced. As she drafted her response, Inez felt a clarity she hadn't felt in days. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel small, who had been dismissed and devalued, who had been told whether explicitly or implicitly that they didn't matter. And in this fight, she wouldn't back down. The morning air was crisp, sharp against Inez's skin as she stepped out of her hotel. The faint hum of the city filled the streets, punctuated by the rhythmic click of her boots on the pavement. Her grip on her bag was firm, her mind racing with the plans she'd pieced together the night before. The airline's carefully worded email had been both an invitation and a warning. They wanted control over her narrative, over the backlash that was beginning to ripple outward. But Inez wasn't about to let them dictate the terms. She made her way to a nearby cafe, a quiet place tucked into the corner of an unassuming street. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint tang of pastries, offering a momentary comfort as she entered. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few early risers engrossed in their newspapers or laptops. Inez chose a table near the window, where the morning light streamed in. She pulled out her laptop, opened her email, and stared at the airline's message again. The words were diplomatic, carefully chosen to avoid any admission of fault. They requested her presence at another meeting, this time with senior executives. It was framed as an opportunity for dialogue, but Inez could read between the lines. They wanted to neutralize her, to present a polished response that would make the growing controversy disappear. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her mind turning over the possibilities. The fight was becoming larger than she'd anticipated, and with it came a greater weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. The question was how to ensure this moment led to something meaningful, something lasting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the chime of the cafe door. She glanced up to see a man entering, his face vaguely familiar. It took a moment for recognition to dawn. He was one of the passengers from her flight, the young father with the boy who had watched her ordeal unfold with wide, curious eyes. The man carried a coffee-to-go cup and hesitated when he saw her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Inez offered a faint smile, inviting him to approach. He took the cue, walking over to her table with a tentative air. "Miss Taver?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "Yes," Inez replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please, have a seat." He sat, placing his coffee on the table but not touching it. Up close, Inez could see the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the kind that spoke of sleepless nights or heavy burdens. He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I don't mean to intrude," he said finally, "but I wanted to say I saw what happened at the airport, and I'm sorry you had to go through that." Inez tilted her head, studying him. "You don't need to apologize for something you didn't do," she said gently. He nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I know. It's just I couldn't stop thinking about it. My son, he asked me why you were treated that way, and I didn't know how to explain it to him." The admission hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Inez leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "What did you tell him?" The man sighed. "I told him sometimes people are treated unfairly because of how they look, because of assumptions others make. But even as I said it, it felt wrong, like I wasn't doing enough." Inez's chest tightened at his words. She had grown accustomed to fighting her battles alone, but here was someone acknowledging the ripple effect of injustice, the way it touched not just those directly involved, but everyone who witnessed it. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Favid Karks," he replied. "Favid Karks." "Favid," Inez said, her voice steady. "You did more than most. You noticed. You cared enough to explain it to your son, even if the explanation wasn't perfect. That's more than a lot of people would do." Favid looked down at his coffee, his brow furrowed. "But it doesn't change anything, does it? You still had to go through that, and my son, he still had to see it." Inez's heart ached at the honesty in his words. She leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened, as if the injustices they discussed were distant, abstract concepts rather than lived realities. "No, it doesn't change what happened," she said after a long pause. "But awareness is a step. Change doesn't come all at once. It happens when enough people decide they won't stay silent anymore. Favid nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about writing to the airline, he said, telling them what I saw, how it made me feel. I don't know if it would help, but it would, Inez said firmly. Every voice matters, and the more people speak out, the harder it becomes for them to ignore. He smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. I'll do it, he said. And if there's anything else I can do, anything at all, please let me know. Inez reached across the table, placing a hand over his briefly. Thank you, she said. Your support means more than you know. As Favid left the cafe, Inez felt a renewed sense of purpose. His words had reminded her that this fight wasn't hers alone. There were allies, even in the most unexpected places. She turned back to her laptop, opening a fresh document. If the airline wanted dialogue, she would give them dialogue, but on her terms. She began drafting a response, each word carefully chosen to assert her position without conceding an inch. This wasn't just about accountability for her experience. It was about forcing the airline to confront the broader issues at play. Her fingers moved over the keyboard with a steady rhythm, the words flowing with a clarity born of conviction. As she wrote, the morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the cafe. The fight ahead would be long and grueling, but for the first time in days, Inez felt a glimmer of hope. This was more than a reckoning. It was the beginning of a movement, and she was ready to lead it. The day of the meeting arrived under a slate-gray sky, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Inez stood outside the airline's corporate headquarters, the imposing building looming above her. A few weeks ago, she might have felt daunted by its size, by the machinery of power it represented. But now, as she tightened her grip on her portfolio filled with testimonies and evidence, she felt only resolve. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed but tense. The receptionist greeted her with a faint smile, her demeanor more reserved than the first time Inez had visited. The whispers about Inez's case, combined with the growing media attention, had clearly reached these halls. A senior executive named Fiona Kaiser, the airline's vice president of customer relations, greeted her. Fiona was tall and composed, her tailored suit and calm expression projecting an image of control. Yet, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, concern, perhaps, or recognition of the storm brewing around them. Miss Taver, Fiona said, extending her hand. Thank you for coming. Let's head to the conference room. Inez followed her through a maze of corridors, her heels clicking against the polished floors. The room they entered was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Around the table sat several other executives, their expressions guarded. As Inez took her seat, Fiona began. First, let me say how much we appreciate your willingness to meet with us. We've reviewed your case extensively, and we're committed to addressing your concerns. Inez met her gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. I'm glad to hear that, but I'm not here for platitudes. I'm here for accountability. Fiona nodded, her composure intact. Of course, we've already taken steps to address the specific incident involving Mr. Miet. He has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Inez's eyes narrowed slightly. Administrative leave is not accountability. It's a pause, not a resolution. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. One of the executives, a man in his 60s with a silver tie, cleared his throat. Miss Taver, I assure you that our intention is to ensure this doesn't happen again. We're also reviewing our training programs and policies to address implicit bias. Policies aren't enough, Inez said firmly. This isn't just about training, it's about culture. Your employees need to know that discriminatory behavior will have real consequences, not just for them, but for your organization. She opened her portfolio, sliding a stack of papers across the table. These are testimonies from other passengers, and even current and former employees. They paint a clear picture. This is a systemic issue, not an isolated one. Fiona scanned the papers, her calm exterior faltering slightly. The other executives exchanged uneasy glances. Inez could feel the shift in the room, the growing realization that this wasn't a problem they could sweep under the rug. I'm not here to tear down your company, Inez continued. I'm here because I believe you can do better. But that starts with real, measurable action. What are you proposing? Fiona asked, her tone cautious but curious. First, transparency, Inez said. Publicly acknowledge the problem and commit to addressing it. Second, independent oversight. Bring in external experts to audit your practices and recommend changes. And third, real consequences for those who violate your policies. No more administrative leave. Terminations were warranted. The room fell silent again, the tension almost palpable. Fiona leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Those are significant steps, she said finally. But they're necessary? They are necessary, Inez agreed, and they're non-negotiable. The meeting stretched on, with every point debated and dissected. By the time it ended, the gray sky outside had given way to a steady drizzle. As Inez left the building, she felt the cool drops against her skin, a welcome contrast to the heated discussions inside. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it from her pocket. It was a message from Priya. Just saw the news. They're holding a press conference tomorrow to announce their new policies. You did it, Inez. Inez's lips curved into a small smile. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were still battles to be fought, still voices to be amplified. But it was a start, a crack in the armor of indifference. The next day, Inez watched the press conference from her hotel room. Fiona stood at the podium, flanked by other executives, her voice steady as she outlined the airline's new commitments: independent audits, transparency reports, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. It wasn't everything, but it was more than Inez had hoped for when this journey began. As the camera panned across the room, capturing journalists scribbling notes and taking photos, Inez felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just her win. It was a win for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. Later that evening, Inez sat by the window of her hotel, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. Her laptop was open, the cursor blinking on a blank document. She had already drafted emails to the passengers and employees who had shared their stories with her, thanking them for their courage. But now, she typed for herself. Today wasn't the end, it was a beginning. A small, but significant, step toward a world where justice isn't just a concept, but a reality. The fight continues, not just for me, but for all of us. And together, we'll keep pushing until the cracks we've made in the system break it wide open. As she saved the document, Inez felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in days. The fight wasn't over, it never would be. But for the first time, she felt the tide turning, and she was ready for whatever came next. And so, this journey was never just about one woman or a single incident. It was about shining a light on a much larger problem, one that so many face but few have the chance to challenge. It's a reminder that sometimes standing up for what's right means enduring judgment, fighting against deeply rooted biases, and refusing to back down when the odds seem insurmountable. Her story is more than an example of courage. It's a call to action for all of us to question the systems around us, to amplify the voices of those who are too often ignored, and to believe that change is possible. But this is only the beginning. The fight for justice and equality continues every day, and it's up to each of us to carry it forward. If this story resonated with you, inspired you, or made you think differently, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and join me as we explore more stories that challenge, empower, and remind us of the power of persistence.